Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments to talk to Bryan Clark, the man who oversees all things naval here, who was part of a great panel discussion at the Heritage Foundation. It was you, Brian McGrath, Jerry Hendricks of now of Telemus Group, formerly of Center for New American Security, and Tom Callender oversaw the conversation, was the moderator for the discussion. And you know, the essential focus of the discussion was the carrier, whether it's a liability, you know, is it a strategic advantage or an expensive potential target, I think was in the headline of that. I know Jerry Hendricks has written a lot about that, right, that we went to big deck aircraft carriers for big airplanes and strategic reach. I know this is something that you worked on. I know that you worked for Chief of Naval Operations Greenert at a time when John Greenert was trying to stretch the legs of the aircraft carrier as well. Talk to us, you know, as the honest broker in this conversation, you know, what were some of the key takeaways for you, but also for the audience and sort of the views they heard this morning?
Well, thanks, Vago, for having me on. I appreciate it. The discussion this morning centered on how do you make the aircraft carrier relevant in an era of great power competition, which may not be exactly the right answer, because the question, first of all, is, do you need an aircraft carrier to deal with the kinds of conflict and competition you have now with great powers? And then secondarily, is it relevant to that set of operations? And so I think too much of the time the discussion about the aircraft carrier is sort of the, how do I make the carrier relevant to future operations, as opposed to saying, do future operations require me to have an aircraft carrier? Would I pursue this if I didn't already have it? And I think the discussion revealed that, you know, there are reasons we would have aircraft carriers in the future, even if we hadn't already bought them. They're useful, providing a sizable amount of power projection in environments where I don't necessarily have land basing available. They can operate at the periphery of great power conflict and do operations into an area where we're actively having a conflict with an adversary like a China or even a Russia. So it gives you options that you wouldn't have with land bases. It's better defended than your average land base. It's also more mobile than, of course, a land base. So there's lots of reasons why you might want to have a mobile, sea-based way of projecting power. Then the question becomes, how do I make it relevant? How do I protect it? How do I make it survivable? And we had a lot of discussion this morning about that, about how do I make the carrier survivable against a country like China that has a large number of precision weapons they can launch within 1,000 miles of their coast. And I think a lot of the advancements the Navy is making in terms of surface ship air defense are going to help with that, because your carrier strike group would have a number of surface combatants that would provide that air defense capacity. Also, the Navy is doing a lot of work on counter-ISR. How do I break the kill chain? How do I make it harder for an adversary to attack the carrier? But then fundamentally what has to happen is the carrier's got to be able to do something, right, which gets the carrier air wing. And so the carrier air wing has to evolve in order for it to have the kind of reach so that if it does move out to this 1,000-mile point where it's able to defend itself adequately, can it do operations that reach into an area of conflict and actually drop, you know, enough weapons and conduct enough, operations to be able to be useful in a conflict with a great power? And a lot of our discussion today centered around also the carrier air wing and its future configuration, the need for it to get longer range, the need for it to be better able to do specialized operations like anti-submarine warfare, and the need for it to be able to have higher endurance or greater persistence than it does today. So it can do offensive operations as well as protect itself.
There was another event today, which was Applied Physics Lab, Bob Work, Jim Miller, Richard Danzig, Avril Haines put their report out, you know, sort of saying that it's time for the United States to challenge certain of its historic assumptions in terms of, you know, its power in this great power dynamic, right? That, you know, in our mental model, we're still a leader in technology. We're still the world's economic superpower. We were 50% of the world's total GDP in 1945. Now we're 25%. And then in a couple of years, when China may have significantly bigger GDP, you know, Richard Danzig made a great point that said every adversary we've ever fought combined had a smaller GDP than we did. For example, Nazi Germany, 30-40%, Soviet Union, 30-40%, whereas China will be actually manifest, you know, multiple times or significantly larger in GDP in a few years. So that what idea was about testing assumptions. In terms of the testing assumptions as far as carriers are concerned, is the Navy thinking the right way about the challenge? Because there are folks who look at the MQ-25, for example, the notion of putting the unmanned tanker on the carrier deck as being sort of insufficient. It's sort of a tanker to extend modestly the legs of short-range fighters, as opposed to sort of strategically changing the game, which is what John Greenert wanted to do, which was, hey, let's have a 5,000-mile platform that can carry 5,000 pounds of either ISR or strike payloads. There were some other thinkers who were even more creative, and they said, hey, make the airplane a one-way airplane that I don't even have to bring back if I don't need to. Is the Navy having this discussion the way it needs to, given what the future holds?
No, it's not. And so I think it goes back to that question of, is a carrier a useful warfighting capability in an era of great power competition? And we think it is, because it does give you this better defended, more mobile airbase. Then the question is, well, in the areas where a carrier can operate effectively, what kind of air wing do I need to have to enable that? Not how do I take the air wing of today and make it more relevant for the future, which is kind of what the Navy's approach has been. So I'm going to add a tanker to it to extend the reach of its already short-ranged aircraft. They need to rethink the air wing, and instead of approaching it from the perspective of what I have today and make it more relevant for the future, go out to the future and say, well, what do I need to have in the future to be able to conduct the operations that I need the carrier to perform? And then how do I evolve the air wing to get to that point? And it gets to what you're saying, is they're going to need to dramatically change the air wing so that it's got a much longer range, longer endurance, which is probably going to drive you to an unmanned solution for the predominant part of your attack aircraft on the air wing. So instead of having 44 manned strike fighters that have short range, we're envisioning a future air wing that's got 24 to 30 unmanned aircraft that have a range of 2,000 to 3,000 miles and are able to operate for a very long period of time and carry a useful payload at that distance and for that kind of endurance. And then you've got a small manned component that might do some of the close air support or command and control operations you need a man in the loop maybe to do in the future even. But that requires you to kind of shift your, like Bob Work and Richard Danziger are saying, you got to shift your focus from, instead of thinking of have I done in the past, how do I do it today, how do I adapt that for a future environment, and instead say, what does the future environment demand without any of my assumptions being carried over? So to the point they made about GDP and the U.S. position in the world, if we are not the predominant player in the world, be it by GDP or military power or any of these other measures, then we need to think of ourselves as more of a spoiler, if you will, or perhaps a nation able to pursue its interests or the allies' interests, but do it by thwarting the efforts of an adversary rather than advancing our own efforts, perhaps. So the carrier might be a component of that effort to deny or thwart the attempts of an adversary at aggression. And that gets to what the NDS talks about in terms of a denial strategy based on a new posture model. And I think a carrier could be a very significant part of that new posture model as part of the contact and blunt force, but it requires you to rethink what the carrier air wing looks like, because you're going to use it for a different set of operations than we have over the last 20 years.
That is truly strategic and doesn't fit in the mental mindset, right, that the carrier force has, which is, what's the first thing the president says, where's the carrier? Right. Where, even if that may no longer be as relevant, a question really at the end of the day. What's it going to take, though? Your CNO, talk to Gary Roughead, talk to John Greenert privately, Admiral Roughead, Admiral Greenert. I think if you cornered Admiral Richardson and asked him the same question, would be enormous frustration at the difficulty of getting the naval aviation community and the carrier community in particular to sort of systemically try to address some of these shortcomings. There was enormous resistance to stealth. It's finally eked its way onto a carrier deck in the form of the F-35, but the Navy, even in making the case for the F-35, has a tendency of sort of not making the case for the F-35. It likes F-18s. What has to happen to get the Navy to fundamentally accept we need to use the ships differently, we need to think differently about what the operations look like, and we need to think differently about what that carrier air wing of the future looks like, which may not have guys who wear gold wings and gals who wear gold wings on their chests?
Well, I think a couple of drivers. One could be just leadership stepping up and driving these kinds of thoughts into the staff. And right now, I think that within the N9 staff, there's a good effort going on to look at the carrier air wing of the future, and they are looking at some of these ideas. They're actually taking a very kind of open-minded approach to say, what is the future demand of us, not how can I evolve what I have today to be able to be more relevant in the future? And I think that's the right approach. And so I see some of that on the part of the leadership driving that discussion. I think the other part of it's going to be financial, frankly. I mean, right now the Navy's talking about, do I buy 2 carriers at once to get some economic order quantity? I think the Navy, if it's going to continue buying aircraft carriers, has to seriously rethink whether it wants to spend the money on aircraft carriers unless it's going to adapt its air wing. If it doesn't change the air wing, the carriers are going to be increasingly irrelevant to the future environment. And therefore, the Navy should be thinking about where do they put those dollars. You might be better off slowing down carrier construction if that means you're able to fund improvements to the carrier air wing that makes those carriers actually relevant to future war fights. And the money may not be there to do both. So I think you're going to have to evaluate on the Navy side, this financial pressure may be enough to cause them to rethink the carrier air wing, because a unmanned air wing or an air wing with a larger unmanned component could be a lot cheaper than one that we have today, because you would buy fewer aircraft overall.
The panel was an interesting panel because you had your former submariner, both enlisted and officer, Brian McGrath, a highly distinguished surface warrior, Jerry Hendricks, P3 aviator, and then Tom's background is
he's a submariner.
He's a submariner as well. That's right. How does the Navy? And I know you worked on the fleet architecture study in your own right, but I mean every single one of these panel discussions that we have that talks about trade-offs, almost all of them focus on the importance of much more sustained investment in long-range strategic air power, as well as the undersea force. And in fact, Jim Miller raised, look, I know this is hard for the surface community to hear, but we don't have enough submarines to do the kinds of things that we need to do. And that's sort of an asymmetric U.S. advantage. Where do you see the state of the debate in looking and reconsidering what our, we're looking at a 355 shipbuilding plan, but that 355 shipbuilding plan is very much driven to, okay, the amphibious guys have to get so many ships, otherwise the Marine Corps won't be happy. We've got to do this 2-carrier thing because at the end of the day, right, carriers are a measure of the battle force, right? They're the ships of the line, so that's what we're judged against. Let's do that. Okay, well, we have to do the frigate as well, and then we have to do the LC. As opposed to saying, hang on a second, no matter what we do, and even if we extend the cores of those 7 Los Angeles-class submarines, which as John Admiral Tamman told us is, why 7? Because that's how many cores there are in order to do that. But that extends the life, that gives the force, but you still look at a bathtub. Does the Navy have to make some more strategic shifts, especially if it may be lucky if it gets 750 and it's not going to get the $1 trillion or not, high 900s that people suggest is what the Navy is going to need?
Oh, I think, the Navy's going to have to rethink sort of what their platform mix should be in the future based on what the environment is going to present them. So what I'm saying there is we've had a lot of emphasis on long-range strike and undersea as being 2 major components of future military force structure. Undersea maybe doesn't mean submarines only in the future, because I think we've given the Russians and the Chinese plenty of indications that submarines are ace in the hole, and that we are going to rely on them to do a lot of early operations in a war fight with either adversary, but mostly China. So if they're the Chinese, you're going to start to develop ways to deal with that, because just like they've dealt with threats above the water. So you're likely to see them pursue a lot of anti-submarine warfare capabilities that are designed to suppress the operation of submarines, keep our submarines from being effective, and start to take away that asymmetric advantage that we have. So we may need to rethink, how much emphasis do I want to place on submarines being my undersea part of the force versus a combination of submarines and unmanned vehicles and unmanned systems that maybe go on the sea floor. So thinking about the undersea differently is probably a component of this, which is going to be a way of maybe driving down the future cost of the fleet as well. So I think there's a combination of an operational need that drives us to a different fleet architecture, as well as a financial imperative that's going to probably require that we think differently about what constitutes the force structure of the future.
And are we thinking the right way? This would be the last question, in terms of how we train, how we prepare. You do a lot of innovative out-of-the-box thinking in terms of, wargaming and how to prepare for the future. You've been, a thoughtful critic of the Navy about what it does right, even in the course of this conversation. When you talk to folks out there, whether in the surface community, I think the submariners are much more sort of game on because of the environment they've always operated in. There's always been a sense that, well, we never really stopped doing it, but the last couple of years we're really stepping up. You're seeing this more in the surface force, sort of starting to go like, wow, we're going into a very different ball game. Are you seeing the organism, the service to which you devoted so much of your life, beginning to sort of see like, wow, different ball game, and you know, is it percolating, and how is it manifesting itself, whether in deployments, whether in exercises, whether in how the whole ecosystem is preparing for this future?
I definitely see a shift and an improvement in how much they're focusing on kind of the threat of great power conflict and how do you prepare for that higher end competitor. I think that where they've kind of fallen short, though, is in translating that clear desire and urgency into realistic training for their operators. So my case there would be, I guess, particularly in the electromagnetic spectrum, is where I think a lot of this competition is going to occur, especially if it is short of a all-out war. You're going to be having a lot of hider-finder competitions in between you and the Chinese, or you and the Russians. And so a lot of that's going to happen in the EM spectrum, and I think we have not developed the tools to be able to train at that level because we're reticent to do it in the open air where somebody might be able to monitor it with their satellites, or just because we don't have the capabilities to operate in that way at all. So building the live virtual constructive kind of training environment is going to be essential if we do to be able to master that electromagnetic spectrum competition, which I think is a key element of being able to prepare for a fight with a high-end competitor.
And I would be remiss if I didn't follow up on one thing, because you mentioned it twice and I didn't follow up with you, and I want to follow up with you. Twice you've suggested there may be better ways to spend money than, for example, on aircraft carriers. It is iconic, it's symbolic. There's a big debate ongoing about whether to start buying them two at a time, which is what we did very successfully. I think Mike Petters, full disclosure, sponsored us at Navy League and is going to sponsor our coverage again at Surface Navy Association, has talked very thoughtfully about, hey, we did this during the Cold War and we managed to get a good discount on the ships. And he's always been very clear in his team, we will build whatever the Navy wants at the end of the day. But you've twice suggested that if you were king for a day, you might spend the money differently. If you're not going to build the carrier, what would you be investing that money on differently, right? Because you've raised that twice already.
So I'd say I would continue to invest in the carrier. So our analysis, and we have a study coming out on the carrier air wing next week, which is part of the reason we're doing this discussion over at Heritage. But we found that there is a need for the carrier as an element of the joint warfight. And we found that its ability to project power and provide fires over a sustained period of time was really important, because in a lot of cases your land bases are unavailable. So yeah, you need carriers in the future. I would continue to buy those. My point would be, though, that if you're going to buy carriers but then not change the carrier air wing, you might as well not buy the carrier, because you're not making it able to provide that relevant combat capability. So I would say if you're faced with a choice in terms of where to spend the money, you might want to slow down carrier production if that means being able to fund the air wing. But if you had sufficient funds to do both, then I would do both if I were king for a day. I wouldn't advocate necessarily this idea of eliminating carriers or slowing down the production of carriers to buy more surface combatants necessarily, because I think we have a pretty robust surface combatant program. We're building a lot of surface combatants. I think what they compose in terms of a missile-based force is really useful in the early stages of a conflict, but they quickly run out of weapons. They have to go reload, and so what's going to be the thing that follows up after they've depleted their stores? Well, it's going to be the aircraft carrier and the carrier air wing. So you got to have that ability to step from missile-based forces that are your contact force to the carrier air wing that's on your carrier strike group as part of your blunt force. You have to have both in order to really deter conflict with a country like a China. So I'd say you need to invest in the carrier and the air wing, but if you can't do the both, you got to make sure you're balancing that investment.
And the last question: HMS Queen Elizabeth, British supercarrier, 72,000 tons, $4 billion, enormous number of trade-offs to get a deck that's almost the same size as a Nimitz class, obviously tailored for the short takeoff, vertical landing F-35, but the ship could easily have been modified to be a catapult and a rescue gear ship. And also at 28 knots has proven to be faster than what she was initially envisioned to do. 10,000-mile unrefueled range at 20 knots, which is not bad legs. There are those who are beginning to suggest that, well, wait a minute, given the kind of future we're going into, does a heavily armored nuclear-powered ship, a fewer number of those, make less sense perhaps than many more ships that have similar kind of capabilities, may not be nuclear, but equipped with 1,500 people? The ship made some survivability trade-offs. It's not as compartmentalized. Right. But in part, that was because a lot of the engineers were like, look, I mean, in the highest intensity environment, dead is dead. You end up at the bottom of the ocean anyway, and so we tried to make trade-offs on likelihood of conflict, survivability of the ship, taken over 20 years of time, cost of production. Do you think that those sorts of, are we there? I mean, is the approach that we're taking the right approach, which is to build these extraordinary ships that are hardened to a degree that no other warship in the world, you know, we saw the Norwegian ship sink. If you look at it, our ships are built differently and so would be far more resistant to that kind of a casualty. Or, do we need to rethink that in terms of we may be able to make certain trade-offs that instead of the nth degree of survivability on 10, 15 ships that we have something less, but be able to build more for that high-intensity engagement, or have we got the recipe about right?
I guess I'd say having a larger number of smaller carriers in our analysis did not yield as much of a benefit as the smaller number of large carriers. The reason being that the large carrier can carry a big enough air wing and generate enough sorties that you're able to deliver combat power over a sustained period of time, and you can defend it because it's in a relatively small footprint. Whereas if you start getting to a more distributed carrier force, then you're not going to be able to defend it as well, and therefore it's going to be more vulnerable. It'll be probably more likely to have to drive around and avoid being attacked. Therefore, its sortie generation ends up going down compared to the larger carrier that's better protected and is able to sort of stand and fight a little bit. So we found that there wasn't that big a benefit to having this more distributed carrier force that might result from having a cheaper carrier. Right. Also, the shifting from nuclear to conventionally powered was a huge problem from a carrier air wing perspective, because that means a lot of your fuel storage now has to be shifted to fuel for the carrier as opposed to fuel for the airplanes, and that has an impact on your ability to sustain sorties over time. So the larger carrier ends up having these sort of secondary and third order effects that improve your ability to deliver firepower over time. And because we don't we don't see the carrier as a replacement for land bases. And if you get to a smaller carrier that you have in a more distributed manner, well, that's kind of the same as you might do if you're going to put a bunch of forward operating bases or forward or arming and refueling points out there, which you could do on the ground for a lot cheaper than building aircraft carriers. So you probably want to have your carrier be more like an emulation of a larger base than it is an emulation of a smaller, outpost.
I was sort of more focused on the survivability trade-off, because if you get the rough sort of flight deck, but you answered it with the nuclear component of it, and effectively, if you get a higher run rate of the carrier you're building now, the cost of it ultimately comes down.
Right. And I agree. On survivability, you might want to, that be an area where, and we talked about that this morning in the panel, the idea that can I drive down the cost of the carrier that we have? So don't start a new carrier program with all of its associated non-recurring engineering costs. Instead, look at the carrier we have, the Ford class, and see how can we continue to reduce cost by maybe accepting some survivability trade-offs, because we don't necessarily intend to drive it into the teeth of a conflict and expect it to fight its way out of a highly contested.
You're saying a rainstorm of DF-26s would be problematic for a future carrier?
That's right, exactly. So you may want to make it so that we take into account the defensive capacity that the carrier strike group provides and say, well, within that defensive capacity, I should be able to accept a certain number of hits before I'm faced with the probability of losing the ship. So we could probably do some survivability trade-offs that would reduce the cost of the ship and would, if nothing else, save money that we might use to put towards the carrier air wing.
And you don't think that at that cost, right? The problem with any icon, it is an iconic weapon system, and to paraphrase one of your former colleagues, right, Tom Earhart, when icons fall, entire edifices collapse, which is the problem with it. Is there a danger of having so few such prominent ships that cost so much and have so many people on it that your adversary knows, if sunk or gravely damaged, would be problematic to the very image of American power projection and capability and military superiority?
Right. Well, it certainly incentivizes an adversary to go after it. So you'd want to make it so that it's not your only way of delivering firepower. So it's obviously a complement to what is being done, what could be done from land bases, both traditional main operating bases and smaller forward operating bases. So the carrier, clearly is an icon. It's always going to be an icon, no matter whether you make it a little bit smaller or it's the same size as it is now. So I don't think it changes that strategic discussion, the communication discussion like that. But in terms of its warfighting capability and the loss of that capability that might result from it being successfully engaged, that's probably an area where you need to just look at that in the context of the joint fight and say, if I lost a carrier, how would I make up for that loss of sorties, that loss of ability to control seas around that area, and how would that impact be borne by the joint force?
Bryan Clark here at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Thanks
Vago.
very, very much.